Hello, good evening and welcome to this evening's event, Adapting Andromeda, a pre-show roundtable discussion. I was just waiting for a minute to make sure that various people arrived, and we've got a good number here, so we'll get going. I'm Professor Wes Williams. I'm the director of Torch. I'm also a professor of French literature, mainly working on 16th, 17th century, and the reason I'm telling you that will become evident in a minute or two. We at Torch are delighted to be bringing you this online event this evening as part of the Humanities Cultural Programme, one of the founding stones for the future Stephen A. Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities that's coming to Oxford in the next few years. This project has also been generously supported by the Arts Council England and Camden People's Theatre, and its early development was supported by the Torch Theatre's Seed Fund. Tonight, playwright Hannah Greenstreet and director Charlotte Vickers will be in conversation with Marcus Bell and myself as we delve into the creative process of adapting a Greek tragedy for the contemporary stage. Hannah and Charlotte's new play, Andromeda, combines fragments from Euripides' Andromeda with a contemporary love story between two young women. It will be performed at Camden People's Theatre at the end of July, in other words, in just a week and a bit more's time. It will also include a live streamed performance. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to add them at any time during the conversation, ideally into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Now, formally to introduce my fellow panelists. Dr. Hannah Greenstreet. I'll wait till she comes on screen. Hello Hannah. Hannah is a playwright, a researcher, and a theatre critic. Andromeda is Hannah's fifth play, and her work has already been performed in London, Edinburgh, Oxford, Cambridge, and Nottingham. She's developed her playwriting through writer development programmes, including Spread the Word's Power Scheme, Soho Writers Lab, the North Wall Arts Lab, and the Menagerie Young Writers Programme. In 2019 to 20, she was a Spark supported artist at Pegasus Theatre in Oxford and was commissioned to write their Young Company's 2021 summer show, Goldfish. Hannah also recently completed, and many congratulations on this, her DPhil on, quote, experiments with realism in contemporary feminist theatre in Britain, here at the Faculty of English at the University of Oxford. I say here because I'm sat in Oxford, although not everybody on this call, of course, is, and that's part of the wonders of Zoom. She is also co-editor of Exeunt magazine. So as I said, welcome Hannah to this discussion. Also here is Charlotte. Hello, Charlotte. Charlotte Vickers is a director and fundraiser who's worked with Nottingham Playhouse, the North Wall Art Centre, the Oxford Playhouse, and Theatre 503. Charlotte trained at the Young Vic, also on the North Wall Catalyst programme, and with Lisa Cagnacci. She was a drama officer at the University of Oxford in 2017 and combines directing with a whole range of other interests, including, obviously, classical myth, as we'll find out more today. And finally, Marcus. Marcus Bell. Hi, Marcus. Marcus is a DPhil candidate in classics at the University of Oxford and co-founder of Queer and the Classical. Marcus is working on choreographing tragedy at the turn of the 21st century, with a particular focus on the relationships between the postmodern and the classical. They completed their BA and MA in classical reception at King's College London with Professor Edith Hall before moving to Oxford, where they're supervised by Professors Fiona McIntosh and Felix Budelmann. Marcus is also a dancer and choreographer, and so it's interested in practice-based and practice as research. Through the development of their thesis, they aim to align queer theory and practice in theatre, performance studies, and indeed the classics. The shape of our conversation today is roughly as follows. So I'm going to do a kind of whistle-stop tour of through various pictures, introducing us all to the Andromeda myth. My focus will be on 16th, 17th century imagery and some theatre, just because that's the bit I know most about. But that's to sort of introduce the story and a number of different questions around the Andromeda story. We'll then move to have Hannah and Charlotte sort of hold the basis of the conversation to talk about making the show itself. And then we'll move where the focus moves a bit more towards Marcus and to the question of queering the classics more broadly, and also how you reconstruct work with fragments, which is of course what a lot of textual philology and indeed postmodern stuff is all about. So that's the shape of everything, everyone, and hope you enjoy what's to follow. As I said at the beginning, please do post questions as we go along, because towards the end of our discussion, we'll also pick up on people's questions. Maya, could you give us the first slide, please, while I start off our kind of whistle-stop tour? So here we have Perseus and Andromeda by Titian in the Wallace Collection, which is now in the Wallace Collection in London. It sets out the basic triangle, if you like, so the core of this story. The vulnerable girl in distress, chained to a rock, offered as a human sacrifice to the monster in the sea, coming out of the sea, and the hero, the male hero, who comes to save her by killing the monster. In the background, you can just about see the community from which Andromeda comes, which is Ethiopia, despite her whiteness, and we'll come back to her whiteness as we go along. To some degree, the reason she's tied to the rock is because her mother, Cassiopeia, made the mistake of saying that she, Cassiopeia, was more beautiful than Venus. And for that, the community is punished by having a monster come and basically eat up all the girls once every now and then. Different versions of the legend tell it slightly differently as to what the periodic demand on the community is, but either way, this is a community required to sacrifice its girls to a kind of visiting monster. It's then saved by another visiting monster, in this case, visiting hero, which is Perseus flying out of the sky to save the girl. In exchange, he does a deal whereby he gets her in marriage, and the rest of the story continues. This is a painting by Titian, as I say, in the Wallace Collection, where if you go and see it, one of the major things you'll realize is just the extraordinary whiteness of this Andromeda figure. Next image, please, Maya. In French writing, but not only in French writing, the Andromeda legend gets used time and time again as a political emblem of the nation in distress. Here's France, about to be delivered from nasty Spain on the right by Henry IV, and also, as already in the Titian, but here much more so, as a way of portraying the nude female body in a way that's kind of politically and otherwise licentiously, if you like, acceptable. Next image, please. Here is a twist on the story of Andromeda, and this is a novel, the Ethiopian story, which is a story about a woman who is born white to black parents, the king and queen of Ethiopia, and the reason for her birth, or the reason for her whiteness, is that her mother had been looking at a picture of Andromeda at the moment of conception. In other words, this story, which is actually an ancient Greek novel, but was enormously popular throughout the Renaissance, picks up on one of the things that's already there in the myth of Andromeda, or two of the things. One, the power of the women's imagination and the passing on from one generation to the next of women of their own story. And secondly, the paradox, if you like, of having a white child born to black parents, or more broadly, the whole question of the color, the ethnicity, the cultural background of the people involved in this story, because in Greek myth already, the story of Andromeda is partly about the sort of Hellenization or the turning Greek of African culture. Next slide, please. In the 17th century already, there are lots of stage adaptations. So Hannah is by no means the first person to have picked up on the Euripidean legend of Andromeda. This is probably the most famous of them all, which is Pierre Corneille's version of Andromeda, which was a machine play, which actually had flying horses in it and monsters coming out of the sea, cost huge amounts of money to put on, and was one of the first plays to use deep focus perspective within the staging. It was put on in Versailles, in the palace in Versailles, and then also in London. As you can maybe see on the right, Andromeda here is not naked, because it was not acceptable in this bit of theatre in the 1650s to have naked women on stage. Next image, please, and then I'm nearly finished. Here is a response partly to that play, but also to an argument that Corneille himself puts out in the preface to his play, which is, why is Andromeda white? And so already in the 1650s, you have a whole series of poems, images, stories about the Black Andromeda. In other words, how can it be that somebody who's from Ethiopia, who's from Africa, should be white? And so within this story, you have a representation of Andromeda as black, and as Perseus as the white hero coming to save the black Andromeda with the Medusa's head as a in the shield. Next one. Finally, then, here's a very recent version of Andromeda, which is Paula Rego's Andromeda from 1990. Her amazing work is just being exhibited in Tate Britain at the moment. She reimagines the story with only women involved, with the memory, perhaps, of Perseus in the horse, unless you also think that's Perseus in the middle. It's a question as to who that is in the middle, whether it's Perseus being readied for his horse, and that's Andromeda over there with the monster, or whether that's the little Andromeda being got ready, and that's Mother over there with the monster. In other words, this is a story that's lasted over many, many generations, where the triangle of the monster, the vulnerable victim, and the heroic figure gets replayed politically, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of cultural change, and then finally in terms of artistic representation through novel, through play, through poetry, through etching, through painting, and as a kind of competition, if you like, between different artistic forms, which perhaps we'll go on to talk about now. That's the end of my little Whistletops tour. We'll bring everybody else back in again. Hannah, I hope I represented the story more or less usefully for you and Charlotte to think about this, and also Marcus in terms of the kind of classical and other reworkings of it. Perhaps we can start by asking the two of you, Hannah and Charlotte, why did you want to do this? What is it about this story, this myth, all the various questions I raised maybe at the beginning, but also others, that made you think, I want to do this?
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to start, Hannah?
Yeah, I feel like it started with you, so you should start, Charlotte. Thank you, Wes.
Yeah, so it started with a frustration at it was a summer, it was 2017, and there was a lot of queer work on stage, almost all of which was about cisgender gay men, or was made by them or was starring them. And I was kind of, it was just before I graduated from uni, and I was thinking like, oh, I'm going into this world that really thinks it's that's really presenting itself as doing something that I don't feel like it is. And around the same time, I was starting to get quite interested in the idea of the fragment, and thinking about the fragment, and Marcus will be able to speak to this in a much more accurate way, whereas I'm solely going on vibes and feelings here, but thinking about the fragment as something that feels very queer, and thinking about the fragment as a part of thinking about queer history as something that feels very fragmented, and got quite excited about the idea of taking the fragments of an existent play and filling in the space between those fragments with a queer story, which we obviously know isn't the story that it was, but that also we can kind of cheekily be like, well, the rest of the play isn't there, so maybe it was this. And I came to Hannah and was like, do you think this sounds good? And Hannah did think it sounded good, I think. Yeah, so Hannah, what do you think struck you about it as an interesting thing? I feel like I haven't asked you that.
Yeah, I think I was really interested in your idea of let's queer the classics, and had been fascinated by the classics for a long time. Did my undergrad degree in English at Cambridge, and we had a whole paper on tragedy, so I'd sort of been immersed in tragedy, but I'd never actually heard of Andromeda before Charlotte was like, oh, here's this play. So I read the fragments, I read it in the kind of Lerb translation, and was sort of struck by the challenge of how do we make a play from this. And at the beginning I sort of naively thought, oh, adaptation, it'll be easy. But I think increasingly, we'll talk a bit more about the process a bit later, but increasingly we found that in order to do something with the fragments that is satisfying or unsatisfying in an interesting way, kind of dramaturgically, we needed to intervene a bit more. So it might be helpful just from the trailer, you might have seen that we've got bits of the play are about a contemporary relationship between two young women. They've gone to university, they're sort of exploring who they are, all of those identity type things. And then you've also got interwoven bits from the Andromeda myth, probably far more the classical bit than kind of receptions of it. Though I do think, yeah, we should have read Wes's book sooner than we did, and that came slightly later in the process. But I guess that's the magic of research, that it's not necessarily linear. So we've got contemporary storyline between the two women, and then woven in with fragments, I guess, from Euripides, but also because there's actually not very much text left of Euripides. We've stolen or taken bits from Ovid, from kind of other tellings of the myth. And actually that made us very interested in storytelling and the process of storytelling itself. So both how we tell versions of myths, and I think Wes has demonstrated really well how the Andromeda myth has been retold so much, but also how we narrate relationships and how we sort of narrate ourselves. And I think often in kind of LGBTQ theatre, there's a real emphasis on coming out as the kind of teleology of this is what happens, this is the end of the play, this is satisfying. And we wanted to investigate one of our characters not being able to come out, and that as a kind of sticking point. So I guess there are no monsters in our play. We've gone a bit more abstract than that. It's more about what happens when you get stuck between a rock and a hard place, and exploring that kind of stuckness, or as Charlotte put it, what happens when you get stuck between a myth and a hard place, which I quite like as marketing copy.
Maybe took that one too far. And just on the coming out thing as well, just that we also, I think, have this thing of like, if you came out ages and ages ago, then what's the story there as well? What can you still be getting stuck with and still coming up against? And we have these two characters like both approaching this like thing in very, very different ways, reflecting back and looking forward.
I disagree with you that there's no monster in the story. In other words, I think that the monsters, I mean, there's a bunch of monsters. It's true, there's no flying horse and there's no great big monster represented, but I have the advantage of having read this and seen early versions of it. But in a way, how about, I mean, isn't the monster precisely part of what you've just been talking about, which is the sort of imperative that you must come out in a particular way, or that you must declare yourself and you must shape your sexuality in a particular way? It seems to me that at least one of the, I don't want to give too much away, but at least one of these characters finds that metaphorically monstrous, in the sense that it's too much. It would be too much of a sacrifice. There's too much of herself and her family and all the rest of it that they would be giving away to subscribe to that ideal. And is, I mean, am I overstating that as monstrous in a way?
No, I don't think you're overstating it. I think we found the monster quite difficult, in that how do you adapt, a monster into a kind of contemporary play? Because I guess so we've sort of got two worlds in the play, and one of them is contemporary reality, and then one of them is this world called chaos space, which we've sort of stolen from Ovid and the kind of creation myth that before everything there was chaos. And I think the trailer represents that really nicely with some of the kind of sound and lights and things. So we've sort of been thinking that there's no literal monster, but maybe, yes, the monster is pressure or homophobia or all of those kind of things.
Yeah, and I think also that the metaphorical monster is never the same thing. I guess that's it. That was certainly a point in the development at which we realized that trying to be like, well, this thing from the myth is directly represented in this thing in the contemporary story just wasn't going to work, and that it was far more, we could get far more from it, and it was far more interesting if we allowed all of those meanings to shift the whole way through the play. And so whenever the characters are talking about a monster, they're often talking about different things, and sometimes even when speaking directly to each other, one of them will be imagining one thing and one another, and that could shift like multiple times during a scene. Rather than at one point, I think very early on, we were sort of like, just how do you make just a massive sea monster appear on stage with a very small budget?
Yeah, blame Charlotte for not letting me have a real sea monster. I guess what's also interesting in the storytelling aspect of the play is that it's enabled us to interrogate the myth and to interrogate some of the gender politics and sexual politics of especially in kind of making it about a relationship between two women, but just to I don't think this is giving too much away. The first scene is very much Greek tragedy, high drama, and then we go into something a bit different, and the characters sort of filter the myths through their lives. So we have modern characters, Percy and Andy, who filter the myths through their own lives. And Percy really has a hero complex, and you realize that it just doesn't quite work in modern life, modern relationships, to think you're saving someone, and she has to navigate that. And yeah, also to interrogate the kind of racial politics of who is Andromeda. As well.
Can you talk a bit more? Marcus has been very patient here, and I'm sure he's got lots to say about Fragments and all the rest of it. We'll come back to that in a minute. But could you talk a bit more about the actual kind of making process? So we started this bit of the discussion with you each sort of going, how about we fill in the bits? How about we tell this story differently? How do you get from there to where you are now? I mean, this is draft N.5, I don't know how many.
7.
But okay, talk us through that process a bit, and how does one know, right, this is ready to go on stage, it's ready for people to come and see this?
We had one evening very early on where we printed off the existent fragments and cut them out and moved them around on the table, and that didn't magically produce a play, which was quite upsetting. So we then Hannah sort of went away and wrote scenes, I think it was, like just sort of creating scenes, and we then were lucky enough to get space at various different theatres to do. We had a couple of readings quite early on, which were really useful to kind of figure out a bit more of the structure, and then we had a research and development period in early 2019 in Oxford, which was kind of a lot of sort of scene generation, and that was when we worked with our translator, Astrid, who sort of came in and gave us a lot more information as well about both not just the myths, but about classical reception, the kind of filling in the gaps in Hannah and I's classical knowledge, which was very much about sort of the literature and the stories, but not necessarily how that worked in Greek society as well. And then we had a sort of a kind of work in progress performance at the Nottingham Playhouse at the end of 2019, and then we were due to be on in this full production last summer, which didn't work out for unsurprising reasons. So that's how we got to here now. Have I missed any major steps, Hannah? Does that sound?
No, I don't think so. I guess from the amount of research and development the play has had, has also sort of contributed to its form, I guess, that it's quite playful. Some of the scenes retelling the story of Perseus and Andromeda are sort of based off of improvisation some of our actors have had. So it enabled us to be very playful with the material and experiment, and it's turned into a very collaborative project. So Martina Astrid Rodder is our translator, and they produced a new translation of all of the fragments, and particularly the first big chunk, which is almost the first scene of the play, messed around with a bit. But I think it's even funny just thinking about different expectations coming in from different disciplines. So I think Marcus may talk more about this, but Astrid was going off quite a philological approach to fragments and sort of expected that I would be very faithful to the fragments and sort of try and reconstruct something. And actually I was more interested in using it as a jumping off point, using it as something to play with in a very experimental way. So I think we've learned a lot throughout the process, and it's been really lovely to sort of have that research element all the way through, even if it's not necessarily we're not starting as experts, but I feel like we've learned a lot more along the way by how we've approached it.
This is all music to my ears, somebody who through Torch is trying to work out precisely a space for practice-based research, but also research as practice within Oxford more broadly, but yeah, also as a kind of theatres working with scholars, working with performers and so on and so forth. Perhaps we could bring Marcus in already around the fragments, because there's a very nice question from, now I'm afraid I can't literate from the Russian, but somebody sent in a question asking about the fragments. What kind of fragments are they? And are the fragments only monologues? Let's start there. Who knows that? Is that Marcus who knows that about this particular text? Or is it Hannah and or Charlotte, or is it anybody else? Who's going to tell us about this particular bit of Andromeda, the classical version? Marcus, are you happy to talk about that?
So I actually can't talk with a lot of authority about kind of what the constitution of the fragments are. I believe Martina in their role as kind of dealing with those materials would be kind of best placed to answer that question. So apologies to the person who asked it. But I think it's a really interesting place to start thinking about how fragments, on one side can seem like this big philological project, right? And we've talked about faithfulness, about accuracy, which ascribe us to a certain model of the classical, a certain idea of the classical as being the ability to produce certain forms of objective knowledge. And I really like the work that you're doing to resist that kind of tendency. So I almost kind of, apologies to this person, want to kind of turn it back to you, Hannah and Charlotte, to thinking about process and how the fragment could become material. How the fragment becomes an object, an open or partial object in the rehearsal room. I have other questions as well about all of the interesting things Wes you brought up around colonialism and race and classics too, which maybe we can get to, but I just was wondering if we could start from that kind of fragment as material place.
Thank you. So I mean, I can say a little bit, but I'll only say 2 sentences about, only because the fragments from Euripides precisely were largely unknown in the 16th and 17th century. So people knew it through Ovid. And when they emerged, yes, it is not just monologues, because there's also narrative and effectively chorus, which is one of the other questions which somebody who might be Omer, I'm not sure because I can't transliterate the middle bit of the name, where they ask, and what about the chorus? Did you plan to introduce the chorus into the play as a counterpart which stands for public opinion and so on? So perhaps it's worth, again, without giving too much away about this show, it's a two-hander, isn't it? I mean, that's not giving too much away. There are 2 characters they are doubled in some sense in chaos space by other characters, but it's not a sort of straightforward representation of all the various figures in the original classical play. But do you want to say something about how chaos space might be thought of in relation to a chorus, or in relation, because you've talked about in relation to Ovid's sort of creative space at the beginning of the world, but is it too much to think of chaos space as in some way related to the chorus, or again, are we going too far there?
I think that's a super interesting question that I actually hadn't thought about before. Just to go back to Marcus's question and Oleg's question. So fragments, it's basically the opening scene of the play when Perseus is like Andromeda has changed the rock and she's lamenting, and Perseus flies in and sort of sees her. And then there are various little bits just from 1 or 2 lines from later in the play. There's not too much chorus in the fragments, and I think Charlotte and I decided not to have a chorus, but it's interesting to think that maybe we could see chaos space as chorus. I guess it's also narrative, because it's Percy and Andy are sort of filling in the rest of the story for us as well. So thinking about fragments as material, I think
before you jump there, sorry, yeah. I'm going to interrupt you, because Charlotte, do you have things to say about chaos and chorus?
I do, because it's come up a bit in rehearsals recently. It was something, because it was something that Hannah and I spoke about very early on, and that we were kind of like, well, it's a two-hander. We don't want to bring in a chorus that felt like it would really interrupt that. But I have started to, as we've been shaping the chaos space into something that actors can work with, or that they can feel like that they're performing in, into thinking about the audience really, and thinking about the relationship that they have with the audience. So it's being in CPT is kind of it's a small space. It feels like you feel like you're all in the room together. It's not and it was interesting. We've kind of been looking at like images of the huge Greek theatres, and thinking about, okay, what's it going to be like creating that in this black box space, but sort of thinking about the chorus as almost the figures that the group that hold the characters accountable. And have been thinking about moments in which the characters can use the audience for that, and the way that they're like using direct address, and thinking about the way that they're storytelling to each other as almost being like a chorus-like relationship, which is something that we ended up talking about, particularly when talking about Perseus and how Perseus sees the audience, but that's ended up kind of bleeding into the way that we look at Andy and Percy, and how when they're in that space in which the audience exists for them, the audience can become the chorus as well.
Thank you. And again, before we go back to Fragments and some of Marcus's questions, in fact, Marcus, I'll put you on notice, if you like, that I might want to ask you to say a bit more about the question of race and sort of decolonizing and so on that you mentioned a moment ago, because one of the other questions that's in the chat is around a bit of our earlier discussion about the monster, and whether transferring the monster into something metaphorical. So this is Rifat who's asked this. Thank you for your wonderful discussion. I'd like to ask you about your decision to replace the monster with something more abstract. Is it to make it more relevant for a modern audience, which is one of the things you said, Hannah, first of all? Or is it to give your version new meanings? Or is it something else again? So could we just come back, if you like, to that sort of abstract metaphorization of the monstrous as part of the making of the show? Again, either of you want to speak on that before we get to Marcus?
Yeah, I think those are all really good suggestions. And I really like how people encountering my work is bringing more meanings than I maybe originally intended. I think it's actually, and maybe this speaks to Fragments as well, but me sort of trying to grapple with, on the one hand, the source text existing in Fragments, and then what my kind of ingrained idea of what makes a play, which is probably based on like Western dramaturgical norms, but anyway, that's my idea in my head of what makes a play that audiences will sit through and find satisfying in some way. And I kind of thought, well, it's sort of like, it's semi-realistic half of the play. They're quite realistic scenes. And one of my academic interests is in realism, so I'm trying not to go like full academic hat there, but so I guess we were keen not to go fully into the fantastical, although we do play with different kind of dramaturgical modes throughout the play. But what I wanted to do with the Fragments is think about how we can do contemporary fragments as well, as ancient fragments. So we've got fragments of Andy and Percy's relationship, and Charlotte's kind of rationalized this as when you try and narrate your relationship, you think about fragments of moments, like this is the moment we first kissed, this is the moment we first met, this is just a random moment that I remember, and you interweaving those contemporary fragments with the ancient fragments. So yeah, I think that's my answer. Thank you.
I should say I'm just at the moment, this is anecdotal, but I'm just at the moment reading Paul, I don't know how to pronounce this, I confess, Preciado's Can the Monster Speak, which is clearly working with fragments as well as very strong first person narrative. So the degree to which the fragment can be used within kind of monster discourse around questions of gender and non-binary and differing sexualities to the sort of well, I'm not going to say classical norm, because who knows what the classical norm was, which is about what Marcus is going to tell us, is a really interesting question. So Marcus, over to you for a minute or two of thoughts on the fragment in relation to this, or questions that we might then engage with in relation to fragments.
Thank you so much, Wes, and Hannah and Charlotte, for really kind of stimulating discussion about the project. I think all of the big themes that have come up, fragment, monster, the relationship of race to this myth, are like really important when we're thinking about the classics or the classical as a history or disciplinary history that has often kind of supported colonialist endeavors, and has even kind of impact on the version of the story that you're telling. I'm wondering if, as kind of like I think you start to think about questions, if the relationship between classics as colonial history and shaping and formation of India and Pakistan have come up in the rehearsal room. I liked your slip, Wes, between hero and monster that Percy can take, and thinking of Percy as this, the potential for Percy to be this white savior figure throughout the play.
Yep.
Potentially how that's all relating together. Fragments also form a really interesting part of this story, as they often present the classicist as something, a smaller part of a whole in which that rest of the whole needs to be accurately reconstructed, or the whole needs to be found again. In Queering the Classical, which is a kind of project that has been ongoing with a number of folks over the last year, we've been trying to think about, what is it that draws queer folks back to the ancient world? What are these kind of affinities? What are these kind of emotional connections and ties that we have to ancient material and myths? But also then how can we do that with an awareness of the kind of power structures that come along with things like the classical? So the kind of ideas of colonialism, of racism, that's still very prevalent today. And fragments, I think, can form a big part of this, especially when they're taken as something that needs to be filled, the gap needs to be completed, a system of knowledge needs to be imposed in order for them to make sense. Sorry for kind of trying to kind of drag a lot of stuff together, but I was wondering mainly about that relationship between classics and colonialism in India, in your telling of the myth in Pakistan, the formation of Pakistan. But also, again, just a kind of reiteration of the previous, which is, how kind of how fragments can become open. You use Sappho as well, which is another incredibly fragmentary source throughout the work.
So you've been offered a rich set of questions and points there. Charlotte, do you want to start off?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we that came up a lot in our early development of the play was Percy as white savior, and it was kind of something that we realized we had to acknowledge and had to confront, and also that Percy had to acknowledge and confront as well, that there is that thing of Perseus being a monster as well. I also noticed that from you, Wes. I thought it was great. But I think when we think about, so when Perseus is on his way back to Greece, he's on his way back from killing Medusa and slaughtering her. And we do have this thing in the play as well of Andy and Percy slipping between how they refer to this head that exists on stage for the duration of the play, that the head becomes a weapon, and then at one point one of them is like, that's a woman's head that you're talking about. So Perseus is only able to save Andromeda because he's killed Medusa, who has also sort of ended up in a mess because of the gods, rather than necessarily because of her own behavior. So I think, sorry, I've got distracted thinking about Medusa there, but I think that it was definitely something that we really lent into. I don't think we haven't looked particularly at kind of early India and Pakistan. It's been much more about contemporary culture and how, and looking at how Percy's white privilege makes her see things differently, and how she can sort of have that revealed to her and realize things through that, and then looked at the kind of the way that the myth itself looks at race as well. We haven't kind of filled in the middle as much. Yeah.
Hannah, do you want to add to that? Thank you, Charlotte. That was very cogent and clear.
I think just to clarify for people who haven't seen the play, that contemporary Andy in our version is British Pakistani, and Percy is Greek British. So yeah, thinking about in particular, the myth is about religious difference, and one of the big sticking points is Andromeda's father saying, you can't come and marry our daughter, you're from a completely different culture. And then we think that a lot of the play was actually Perseus trying to win over Andromeda's father to get the hand in marriage, and kind of negotiating that religious and cultural difference. So that's partly what we wanted to explore in the play, but also to acknowledge, I think, something we've lent into, as Charlotte says, is the sort of messiness of the source material, the messiness of relationships. And I think with Fragments, you can't solve them. And I think that's really nice, that in some sense, yeah, they will be messy, they will be incomplete. You're not getting this perfect, complete play. And that's really okay as well. But yeah, I think it's super interesting.
There's somebody's put in the Q&A bit of the chat that there aren't many roles for people who are non-binary, and that, well, they're very grateful to you for creating this. I think one can also build on that, and it's great to have that expressed, but also to go back to something that Marcus said about, in a sense, thinking of classical stories and of Fragments in particular as a kind of resource precisely for new forms of representation. I mean, I tried to do that already in the 16th, novels, plays, painting. Each time you encounter a myth, you kind of remake it, not in your own image, but to see where the tensions within the myth are, whether they're religious, whether they're ethnic, whether they're through different forms of cultural representation, or whether they're even artistic. Are you a sculpture, madam? No, I'm not. My hair's moving. Can't you see? Oh, blimey, you're a real person. All right, I'll save you then, is effectively what Perseus says when he first sees her. So that whole sort of process of, I can remake something here, seems to me really powerful in your telling of the story. And also might mean that the classics is precisely, I would dare say this is one of the things you're discovering, Marcus, is that classical narratives, classical plays, classical fragments can be thought of as a rich resource for precisely non-binary, queer retellings, transnational in an exciting way, but or even reinventing what it means to be British, that isn't about just repeating a colonial version of the classics. Again, am I making sense here for Marcus in particular, but also Charlotte and Hannah? Is that partly what you guys are showing with this production? Hannah, you're nodding vigorously here, so I think that means yes. Does it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting here to, in the kind of early stages of development, we partnered with Pegasus Theatre to run a workshop with their young company, some young people. And I think one of the aims of the workshop, which was about, we gave them bits of fragments from a variety of Greek plays and sort of bits of myth. And one of the aims of the workshop was really about empowering them, when they probably hadn't encountered classics before, to think about, yeah, this is a resource of stories that they could reshape and use to tell their own stories. And yeah, I think that's partly what we are doing and we want to do in the play. And I think Marcus says it really nicely in terms of, there do seem to be so many kind of LGBTQ people drawn to the classics, but we also need to acknowledge the kind of power imbalances and yeah, dodgy bits of classics as well, and think about how our own retellings can address those quite directly.
Marcus, do you want to speak to that again, or have you said what you want to say? No, go for it. Go for it, please.
More than happy to come in. Yeah, I completely agree. It's about kind of how that relationship functions, right, in the kind of the negotiation of that situation. I'm wondering then, kind of going back to that idea of chaos space, that it seems so present kind of as a way of coming out of both the kinds of forms of like more typical realist dramaturgy, which I know you're deconstructing in the performance, but also potentially as a space of resisting the kinds of power structure that are operating within ideas of the classical through its kind of colonial forces. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that kind of chaos space as maybe a place of kind of queer potential in terms of the play, but also in terms of like how it's being staged. I think that would be really exciting for me, if that's all right.
Yeah, I can speak to this a bit. I remember having a conversation with Hannah during one of our R&Ds and saying, I really think that we're tapping into something about queer time here. And she sort of looked at me and was like, the play doesn't have space for that right now, but like, if you want to do it, that feels like your job. And I was like, okay, great. But I think the chaos space absolutely is thinking about like queering the form and giving, like, we have a lot of questions in this chaos space, like, when is it? What is it? And I feel like the way that we've ended up creating it is being like, we don't quite know. It's deliberately not quite anything. At some points, it's a moment when these two contemporary characters can embody these mythological figures, but at some points it's kind of a moment when one of them can talk to the audience and be like, oh my God, I just kissed her and it was the best thing ever. And it can be all of those things, and they kind of enter into and out of this space when they want to as well. There's a lot in it that I've been talking to with my design team about the idea of Andy and Percy controlling this space and it feeling like they're sort of taking over the theatre, and that the theatre itself is becoming an extension of them, and that it's them choosing to tell us this story in exactly the version that they want it to be told in, which isn't necessarily linear, and which doesn't necessarily cover everything, and which also sometimes means we will in like some moments in the play, we kind of hear one of them say what just happened and hear the other say what just happened, and they've got completely different versions of the same story, but that the space sort of allows both of those things to be true. I think one of the really brilliant things that Hannah's done is created a play that's really generous to both of its characters, which kind of comes back to what we were saying about the monster, that the monster can be all sorts of different things, and that there isn't an antagonist in the play, even though there are these monsters. But yeah, I feel like I can't quite say exactly what it is, but I do feel like the chaos space feels like this kind of this dream world that they've come up with that feels very queer to me somehow.
Oleg's asked, sorry Marcus, were you going to say something there? No, Oleg's asked a question that pretty much picks up on this and says, can you speak a bit more closer about time and space in the play? There was darkness in the play and there were video blendings on the screen. Do these blendings serve as recollections, or do they transmit the thought and emotions of the actors hic et nunc, here and now, in the place where they are? Or do we actually, is that just trailer stuff? Is there none of that actually on stage?
Should I answer this, Hannah? A little bit of both. So some of it is just trailer stuff. Some of it is we wanted to get the idea of the fragments in the trailer, so had the fragments of Hannah's text. Mm-hmm. But there is also this thing that while one of our characters is a classicist, the other character is a physicist. So we have this idea of space and the stars, which kind of ties in very neatly with the myth, because at the very end of Andromeda and Perseus's lives, they are turned into constellations. So we do have this idea with chaos that it could also kind of be outer space, mm-hmm. And that while Percy often uses the myth as a way to figure out her feelings on things, Andy will turn to the stars, which then also creates interesting crossovers, because you feel like there's a quote from Ovid in the play where Ovid talks about men turning to the stars to understand the world that they exist in. I think that answers that.
I think it does. Hannah, do you want to say anything more about this sort of, why have you got an astrophysicist in your play?
Well, I think it's exactly what Charlotte was saying, that it's a metaphor that links both worlds, that stars is something they share. So Andy is the astrophysicist, Percy is a big fan of Greek myths, and stars is the kind of way they bond. Charlotte and I, after we'd written quite a few drafts of the play, did talk to an astrophysicist who did tell us some of our understanding of astrophysics was very basic and probably not true, but that's the wonder of theatre. Not everything has to be exactly true.
Okay, well, that's a very nice link to our next question from Rifat, which is it's about time. In other words, how knowledge or experience changes over time. In what ways do you think time from classical to modern has changed the notion of racism, gender, religion, ethnicity, and so on? More specifically, do you think things are worsening or getting better? And how do you depict this as realist in the modern version? There's a lot of questions in there. Do you want to pick out one or two? That's in the chat if you want to, or rather in the Q&A if you want to see what Rifat's actually kind of, or run through it yourself. Let's take it first of all. Are you interested? Is this a play? Is either Marcus, Hannah, Charlotte, anyone interested in, if you like, the differing representations of race, gender, religion, ethnicity in classical texts and in this modern story? The answer must be yes, otherwise you wouldn't be telling the Andromeda story. So there's some way in which you're connecting now to then. Do any of you want to say about that, anything about that connection?
I had an initial thought, and I think this is a really incredible question, and I apologize for kind of taking it like looking at it kind of from a little bit of a different position, because I think that there's a question in here of, in what ways do you think time, like as in the construction or modeling of time, has itself influenced the formation of concepts of race, gender, and religion?
Absolutely.
And I think very much in the idea of a classical past that leads in a linear fashion from ancient Greece and Rome to a form of modernity or modernism, and then even more dangerously, right, to an idea of the West, Western identity, often tied with whiteness. That modeling of a linear temporality has been incredibly influential and formed the concepts of race, gender, and sexuality that we deal with today. I mean, it's why the classics gets brought in kind of colonial settings in order to enforce notions of sexual norms or gendered norms. There's brilliant books about this. Gomida Bahambra is really great on unthinking the coloniality of time. So I think it's a really brilliant and spot on question. I don't know if I can answer the second bit about kind of progress, things getting better or worse, but this idea of, you know, this dangerous and racist idea of kind of things being more backwards in time, being less developed, has been massively influential on conceptions and conceptualizations of racism. And classics is, you know, the classical is a big part of that formation.
My classic Zoom mistake. I muted myself and then the question about is it getting better or worse reminds me of another debate discussion that we had, as it were, in this space, in Zoom space, a couple of weeks ago with Benjamin Zephaniah, the poet and activist, who was asked, do you think it's worse now than it was in the 70s, or was it worse in the 70s? And he kind of found it a really difficult question to have to think about. And he said, on the one hand, clearly it's a lot better because you can even ask me that question. And here I am in Oxford, on Oxford University time, talking about these things. In other words, there's a space now for the kind of poetry that Benjamin does within, you know, it's on the national curriculum. So there's a kind of, voices are heard now that weren't heard, let's say, 20 years ago. And that's true within classics as well, of course. But at the same time, Benjamin Zephaniah said, yeah, but racism is now officially sanctioned within the academy in all sorts of ways, and certainly within the current political class in all sorts of ways. You know, just the last 2 days around the football has shown us that. And so I think really, I'm just repeating Marcus's notion that this is a really great question and that it's a very hard question to answer. But one way of answering it is precisely to disrupt this notion that we must be better than we were in the past, or we must be somehow more advanced than those barbarian civilizations, which is actually one of the things that the Andromeda myth is itself about. Of course, you know, Perseus is coming along and saving this girl from Ethiopia and from ritual sacrifice and taking her off to some wonderful Greek space where we don't do that anymore because we're a different religion and so on and so forth. And I just wondered, to come back to your play, there is an element of some of that in your story, in having Andy as a Pakistani British character who's having to wrestle with a whole set of cultural stereotyped cultural traditions which produce certain kinds of difficulties, to go right back to the monster at the beginning, for her, which are not quite there for Percy. And I wondered if you could just say a bit about that, just as we come towards the end of the discussion. A bit more about how that distribution of where the difficulties lie for each of these characters might be a reflection on this whole history of coloniality and of a history of the representation of race over time. Charlotte or Hannah, over to you for a thought or two on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think, yeah, I think that Percy does have an easier time of it. So our other character has sort of been out as a lesbian since she was a teenager, and she sort of negotiates things very differently. And yes, part of Andy's difficulty with her identity is sort of cultural and thinking, what will my parents say? What will my community say? But some of it is also about her and the kind of person she is. So I think it's really important to avoid stereotypes in representation. And I guess that's what drama allows you to do. It allows you to represent very individual characters in individual situations. And I guess there is a kind of burden of representation on LGBTQ stories because there aren't as many. But I think that should be a reason to have more, and not say this is a sort of definitive representation of any of it. So yeah, more stories.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we've also been quite careful, I think, there's never any point in the play at which the play says, well, Andy's parents are Pakistani British, so obviously they're homophobic. And there are almost points where it seems like Percy might think that, but that actually she's not necessarily right. And I think what Hannah said is totally right, that that Andy's kind of struggle throughout the play is quite deliberately not that, if that makes sense. Like, we were very keen for it to not just be like, oh, well, obviously her parents are homophobic, so obviously she can't come out. But it becomes about much more than that. I just wanted to say as well on kind of that was a bit in the question that I wanted to pick up on. About things about, I think Wes and Marcus, what you've both said is totally true. I totally agree that I think the idea of talking about progress is something that we've done now, and that actually we're way better now than we were is just really problematic. But that in terms of like how we depict it in the show, we do have a content warning on the show for homophobia, because I think it is something that our characters have to deal with, but it isn't something that we wanted to focus on too much. I think I'm looking at Hannah here just to confirm, but that it's something that exists in their lives and that affects the way that they live, but the way that they make decisions, and what they do and what they feel able to do as well. And I think this feels like a problem that all kind of queer creatives have to grapple with, is when you're creating a piece of fiction, do you want to create a kind of utopian version in which there is no homophobia, in which there is no discrimination, or do you want to depict what it's like to live in a world where there is? And I think that for this story, it felt right that we were depicting a world in which that is something that the characters have to deal with.
That takes us back to Hannah's thesis title, Realism in Feminist Theatre. I mean, and indeed to one of the questions clearly early on when we were talking about the monster, you said we didn't want to introduce a level of the fantastic and wanted to keep it sort of grounded in the real. And yet you've got this kind of chaos stroke queer time going on as well. which may or may not be a utopian space, but it's certainly an extension somewhere of themselves. And I suppose the last thing I'd want to ask very quickly as a sort of final question really is, it is a two-hander. You've only got these two. You've got their creative chaos versions of themselves, which is the myth, which is the chorus, which is this space of imagination. But precisely, you haven't got parents, schools, institutional structures around them. And therefore, as you've just said, actually, Charlotte, that means that we don't really know whether the monsters they're grappling with in their heads and their hearts really are what they think they are, or whether those are in some sense created by themselves, by their own anxieties, by their own fears as well. In other words, if you brought mum on stage and she said, but I don't, you know, yeah, you can have the other cliche scene, but I love you as you are, whoever you are, darling, etc., etc. You know, you haven't got that scene either, which has become a kind of classic trope within certain kinds of coming out stories. So you've avoided that too, I think rightly, by the way. But could you just say a bit about keeping it on the two of them, and why you've kept it as their story so strongly? Because that does strike me as a very kind of strong claiming of the myth as these two young women's story. So perhaps we can end with some reflections on that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it partly has always been a two-hander from kind of practical and budgetary concerns. But I think there is something really interesting in it being a two-hander and sort of stripping out all the other characters and just making it such an intensely focused on those two. I guess because it's both of theirs first kind of lesbian relationship, or women loving women relationship, that it's so intense that almost doesn't let the outside world in. And I think you're really right, Wes, that part of the play is that we don't know how much of, and maybe it's one of the sad things of the play, we don't know how true Andy's fears are, and we don't know how things might be different if she acts differently. But I guess this is part of my attraction to the myth, is that image of Andy being Andromeda, mixing them up in my head, Andromeda being chained to a rock at the beginning. We didn't want to do a kind of titillating actor chained to a rock. It's not what we were going for, but I'm really interested in stuckness and how you can get stuck in your own head, stuck by fear, stuck what people will think of you, and to explore that stuckness through the play is what I was interested in doing.
I've done it again. Charlotte, do you want to add to that?
I think Hannah summarised it really well. I kind of don't want to tarnish anything she just said.
Okay.
That was brilliant. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Marcus, I'm going to give you the last word then, in this case, in terms of how to place this particular instance of working with fragments, bringing the research and the practice together, bringing a kind of queer set of stories together with an ancient myth. Obviously one can say this is a great example of this, but what else might one say about how others are doing similar things? Can we put this in a little bit of context just before we re-advertise what Camden People's Theatre are doing, let's say? Can you put this in a little bit of context in relation to kind of theatre practice more broadly at the moment?
Absolutely, and I mean, Charlotte and Hannah will know this from being on the ground, that they're kind of at the forefront of an investigative kind of queer theatre practice that's like working collaboratively in spaces to deal with issues that are kind of not solely, or don't feed the idea of the classical itself, but maybe instead work towards kind of queer communities and queer activism, and kind of decentering the kinds of voices that have ruled kind of theatre and performance spaces, or been allowed to operate in them, probably because of their, you know, proximity to white privilege, right? These white cis gay male voices that have dominated kind of queer theatre spaces. So I think that they're, you know, I don't want to already be historicizing, right, the cool work that you folks are doing, but we could think about Jeremy O'Harris, we could think about Jordan Tannehill, we can think about all the kind of incredible work that Alicia Harris is doing at the moment with the ideas of kind of queer myth, that it's breaking them down, opening them up, and trying to do stuff that is for queer folks, making community with and for each other.
Thank you. We're running out of time now, and usually after about an hour we start to lose punters. We've only lost one so far, so that's a good sign. Talking of punters, everyone present, please do note that if you tried to get tickets for this a little while back and realized that you couldn't because it was sold out, well, Camden People's Theatre has just, because of the new regulations that have been announced, and been able to put out more tickets. Please do either sign up to go along. I hope to be there next Friday, or else join, or on the Friday, or else join in with the live streaming event on the Friday, so that you can see how all this works out in theatre practice as well. Thank you lastly to Marcus, to Charlotte, to Hannah for a really great discussion. Thank you everyone for your questions. And let's hope, oh, Marcus has disappeared, Charlotte's disappeared, Hannah's disappearing now. Let's hope that this indeed is both, you know, an extraordinary, well, I know it's an extraordinary piece in itself, but is also part of a kind of larger set of realignments, both in Hannah and Charlotte's critical and creative lives, but also in the larger frame of rethinking classics, myths, and theatre. I'll end on that note with many thanks to all, and also thanks to Maya backstage, who's been making all of this possible technically. Do check in on the Torch website for other gigs, events, and so on that we'll be running next academic year. We're kind of having a break in August, so don't expect us to do loads of stuff then. But thanks ever so much to all of you for being here, and goodbye.